But you've mentioned it several times now. And frankly, I'm not entirely clear what you mean by it. So I'd love for you to take a 5 minutes, no longer, I'm going to blow the whistle, on meaning. What does meaning mean? And what is it to be meaningful?
5 minutes on meaningfulness. So
5 minutes.
So I'm
Start now.
I'm gonna rely on old school skills and do a compression. So first is in-bed reference to John Vervaeke's 43-hour series on escaping from the meaning crisis. Go watch that. You will then have a much better sense of what that means. But to say, John has a good framework, so I'll use that as well as I can. 4 ways of knowing: propositional, procedural, perspectival, participatory. And they're in a stack, which is to say that participatory is more fundamental and propositional is more rapidly changeable. You can move propositions around faster. Propositional is like what we're doing right now, language. I'm conveying language to you, you're absorbing language, and to some extent you're moving your ideas around in relationship to what I'm saying. Participatory has to do with, it's almost like the fitness of your way of being in relationship to the world that you're in. So if you actually use just evolutionary fitness and extend that to include the whole way that a human can be in relationship with the kinds of niches that we find ourselves in, that's where meaningfulness comes from. That is meaningfulness. So meaningfulness has to do with the wholeness of your entire mode of being in the world, all the different ways that you respond to what is coming at you, that gives rise to your increasing capacity to respond well to what is in the world. So meaningfulness is simultaneously the means to the end of being able to respond to the world in a way that furthers your capacity to respond to the world in the next moment of time, that you are fit in that sense. And also it is the capacity in yourself of how you sense what kinds of changes in yourself are more affordant to increasing that capacity. Does that make sense?
Almost. What exactly is the capacity? Let's make that clear.
The language, I think, of Plotinus talked about the notion of conformation, to conform. So there's a pistol. Let's do that. I have a pistol in front of me. It's a Glock, actually. And so what I notice is there's a way for my hand to be configured so that my hand is holding this Glock in a way that is actually able to pull the trigger effectively. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Now, there's a very large number of ways that my hand can be conformed that isn't in conformity with the affordance of the pistol. So meaningfulness is simultaneously, on the one hand, the practical, which is if I get my hand in the right conformity to the pistol, I can actually pull the trigger. And in fact, if I get my whole body in the right relationship with the affordance of the pistol, I can actually shoot with accuracy. Right? So that's meaningfulness from the point of view of effectiveness in world, in relationship to what the world is offering. And then there's the sense of meaningfulness, which is how do I go about figuring that shit out? Well, what I notice is that if I sort of experiment with it, there's something about the way that I'm holding the gun upside down, if I've got like all my fingers stuck together like the mitt, there's something in me that is telling me that ain't the right way. And so the sense of meaningfulness is the capacity to be able to discern in reality, in this case with the pistol, what are the affordances of that pistol and how does my capacity as a body relate to those affordances, and how do I change myself to conform to that so as to increasingly realize a capacity to be in effective relationship with reality. Now expand pistol to be the whole fucking world.
So essentially you're saying is meaning is figuring shit out.
Yes, figuring out how to actually live in life well. Which is to say, by well, what I mean is not just to live now, but to live ongoingly, right? It's this double order. I have to be able to be in effective relationship with what the world is throwing at me now. But by effective relationship, what I mean is that what I do, how I actually show up, increases my possibility of being in an effective relationship with what the world is throwing at me in the future. That's it.
Okay, I'm going to push back a little bit. One could argue that in the current world, that would say to be meaningful is to become a very good game A player.
Well, if game A was in fact a really valid future, then that would be true.
And it was at some point. So there was a time that being meaningful was figuring out what are the affordances of game A and getting damn good at it.
For a period of time, that was very true. And this is actually quite challenging because remember I said, and I think this is actually a very interesting piece. When I said that game B is sort of omnipresent, but we may be playing it at level 0, I mean that quite seriously. I mean that like 35,000 years ago, game B was present, but game A and game B are co-present. And so there's this really interesting tension that we can feel in ourselves, that as we sort of follow the meaningfulness vector in the direction of game A, we can notice a tension or a lack of integrity, a fragmentation of ourself in relationship to the meaningfulness vector in the direction of game B, because there's a discontinuity between the two. And I think that is really, really a deep point. Like it speaks to why we may have a subjective sense of what the fuck is Rutt talking about, or what is Paul talking about when he says that to play game A well was meaningfulness in, say, the 1950s or say the 1300s. And that's because in the larger scheme of things, right, we've been doing this human thing for 1,000,000 years. And so the 35,000 years where game A was had a certain conformity to it is just a blink of the eye. So what we might say is that our deep, deep, deep sense of meaningfulness has kind of always felt that game A has this taste of short-termism, a taste of making trade-offs between things, and maybe they are the right trade-offs. Maybe I have to make those trade-offs if I want to continue to be able to play the game, but I also feel a certain wrongness to it. And so one of the things we might say is that the fulfillment of game B is a recovery of that, and a moving back into an alignment that even our evolutionary selves can feel is, now I no longer have to, in order to pursue this path of what is actually meaningful, I can actually pursue a path that is feeling increasingly meaningful all the way down and all the way out, which is a very nice orientation.
It's interesting you talk about the sense of wrongness that keeps popping up. And I'm going to give two good examples that were actually pretty major and had some result in game A and twice challenged game A. One is Marx's idea of alienation. The idea that the ever-crunching machinery of capitalism, while it delivers the productive goods, at least for many people, alienates people from a holistic approach to life and work. And he predicted would eventually realize that they were alienated and revolt. And in reality, it turned out game A was good enough at buying them off from their alienation that they have been so far willing to remain alienated. The second, I think, closely related concept, again, a sense of wrongness, was from the 60s, call it the hippie movement or whatever it was going on in the 60s. The word there was inauthenticity, that people were walking away from. And, a lot of people about my age, especially ones just a little teeny bit older, got decent college educations and walked away and built hippie communes, so to speak, to try to achieve more authenticity in their life. The feeling that, putting on the gray flannel suit and going to work in the big bureaucratic behemoths was not an authentic way of honoring our being as creatures in the world.
Yeah.
Those both sort of, I think, get at your sense.
Absolutely. And we can say that, one of the words that I think rings very nicely, and now in this context of meaningfulness as we've described it, is integrity. And here integrity has a lot of, lands for me quite nicely when you think about it, like structural integrity, which is to say that all of the pieces are fitting together well. So alienation is fragmentation, where, okay, I've got some pieces that are fitting together well, but there's a whole other bunch of pieces that are not. And that's what alienation is, right? And inauthenticity is kind of the same thing. And so in this perspective, we can look at it from a meta level. We're like, oh, wow. So the orientation towards meaningfulness includes within itself an awareness of all of the different pieces of myself, and in fact, by the way, of the whole world, that are not in integrity. They are not in right relationship with each other. And by the way, therefore, have less structural integrity. So as we begin to be aware of this, we're like, okay, yeah, those guys were picking things up. And by the way, we can run back in time and see this happening all the time. Like constantly, we were noticing that the trade-offs that we were forced to make by the reality of the world that we were in. And, that's just been the reality, whether it was the trade-off of which of your children dies because you haven't got enough food, or the reality of you're going to kill that other sentient human being because you're at war, whatever it is a separation from a larger integrity, a larger movement of meaningfulness that is subject to the contingencies of now, but we feel in ourselves a wrongness to it. And it's like a pragmatic acceptance now of saying, okay, we're going to be very aware of how do we move more and more in that direction of a greater and greater rightness, non-utopian, right? I'm not proposing by any stretch of the imagination either that we're going to be able to teleport from here to there. We have to actually grow our capacity to include more and more of ourselves and the world in this meaningfulness. And also non-utopian in the sense of there is no endpoint, right? There's just an ongoingness of an increasing capacity to include more and more of ourselves and other people and the world in something that has deeper and stronger and richer integrity.
All right. It's 11 minutes. Not bad for Jim and Jordan trying to talk about meaningfulness.